Washington, October 2025. A federal audit revealed a critical structural failure in the new lunar lander. Dr. Sarah Connolly at the Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel monitored the build. She stated the defect risks the entire timeline. The public expected an active moon base within 3 years. Instead, the actual infrastructure is compromised. Hit subscribe now. You will want to see where this leads. This single-engine failure threatens to collapse a $100 billion lunar program. The system changed. NASA chose to outsource its entire lunar landing infrastructure to billionaire corporations. Private contracts took over. The agency now relies on external engineering to meet its deep space goals. The pad burned. A massive explosion destroyed a New Glenn rocket during a test at Cape Canaveral. Fire engulfed the complex. The blast shattered the single launch facility meant to carry heavy cargo to the moon. This is not fringe history. This is 60 years of unbroken documented record. The data warns us. General Susan Helms, chair at the Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel, who studied spaceflight risk, concluded lunar timelines carry extreme danger. The numbers are clear. NASA faces deep infrastructure flaws that push our lunar base plans past 2029. The public was misled. The space agency promised a quick return to the lunar surface using commercial partnerships. Plans faltered immediately. The public expected a smooth operation but received a string of corporate testing disasters. Money poured in. NASA handed fixed-price contracts worth billions to companies like Blue Origin and SpaceX. Budgets kept rising anyway. This procurement model shifted technical control away from federal engineers and into private hands. The risk grew. Commercial companies move fast and accept catastrophic failures as part of their development cycle. Rockets explode on launch pads. This strategy works for tech companies but threatens human lives during deep space missions. Control was lost. Federal managers no longer oversee every bolt and weld inside these massive exploration vehicles. External corporate boards decide. This creates a dangerous information gap between safety auditors and the launch line. The timeline broke. Blue Origin designed the Blue Moon lander to supply the planned permanent lunar habitat. The recent explosion stops that. Engineers cannot test the landing systems without a working heavy-lift launch vehicle. The target shifted. NASA originally aimed to place astronauts on the southern lunar pole by late 2026. That goal is gone. Independent analysts now view a landing before 2029 as completely impossible. The base waits. Survival on the moon requires tons of life support equipment delivered ahead of the crew. No rockets are ready. Human beings cannot live in a deep space vacuum without this heavy infrastructure. The hardware cracked. Workers at Cape Canaveral found structural issues inside the main propellant tanks after the fire. Metal fatigue occurred early. These material defects show that commercial manufacturing speed compromises basic safety rules. The truth emerged. Documents from the federal audit reveal that multiple engine parts failed quality checks before assembly. Managers ignored the signs. They pushed forward to meet artificial deadlines set by corporate shareholders. The system stalls. A single component failure can freeze the entire multi-billion-dollar international space program for months. Bureaucracy grinds to a halt. We must look at what happens behind closed doors to understand the real cost. Florida, May 28, 2026. An ordinary Thursday night ends with an unprecedented shockwave. A safety engineer monitors telemetry inside the Launch Complex 36 Control Center. He is 34 years old. His monitors display steady pressures across 7 liquid methane engines. The clock ticks toward 9 p.m. local time. Workers secure the area for a routine static fire test. The concrete vibrates. A sudden drop in fuel pressure registers on the screen. The engineer reaches for the abort command. He is too late. A massive fireball erupts from the base of the vehicle. The physical reality is violent. A blinding flash turns night into day across the space coast. The blast wave strikes the control bunker with a deep, low rumble. It shakes residential homes miles away from the pad. It shatters the silence of the marshland. The rocket collapses inward. Tons of highly pressurized liquid oxygen and methane mix instantly. A second explosion tears through the core of the vehicle. The metal skin of the rocket peels away like paper. The structure falls. The heavy transporter erector mechanism snaps under the intense heat. Fire engulfs the entire launch tower. Pieces of burning debris rain down into the Atlantic Ocean. The screen goes black. The engineer sits in silence as the automated alarms stop chirping. He looks at his team. Nobody speaks. They just watched the future of America's lunar cargo system vaporize on live video. The destruction is absolute. The vehicle is completely gone. A massive smoke cloud rises thousands of feet into the Florida air. It carries the smell of burning metal and chemicals. The damage goes deep. The explosion took out at least one major lightning tower. It scorched the launch deck down to the raw rebar. This structure was the only active gateway for this heavy lift system. The payload escaped. A batch of 48 Internet satellites sat safely inside a nearby integration building. They were not on the rocket during the hot fire. The vehicle itself took the entire force of the blow. The site is sealed. Emergency crews wait hours for the toxic gas to clear the pad. They must inspect the wreckage under spotlights. Every piece of twisted metal holds a clue. The investigation starts immediately. Federal regulators arrive at the perimeter before midnight. They establish a wreckage management hotline to track debris. They warn the public not to touch any washed-up components. The recovery will take months. Teams must clear thousands of tons of metal and contaminated soil. They cannot build a new rocket until they fix the ground underneath it. The schedule is broken. This moment shifts the balance of power. The disaster forces NASA to re-examine its reliance on private space partnerships. The illusion of cheap, fast spaceflight is gone. The core reveal shows exactly what this failure did to our plans. That is not the part that changes everything. The investigation uncovered the true scale of the crisis. The destruction of the New Glenn rocket at Launch Complex 36 exposed a fundamental design flaw. This failure goes beyond a single engine component. It alters the physics of the entire Artemis architecture. The first sub-revelation focuses on the rocket's propulsion system. The New Glenn booster relies on 7B4 engines. These engines burn liquid methane and liquid oxygen at extreme pressures. The federal audit revealed a persistent vibration anomaly during high-thrust sequences. This mechanical resonance matches the destructive frequencies found in early Apollo-era testing. Ground stands intentionally stiffen these fuel lines. They damp the vibrations during static tests. But the launch pad environment allows the lines to flex freely. The metal fatigues within seconds under flight-like loads. This hidden defect means the vehicle carries a high risk of catastrophic failure every time it leaves the ground. Before we get to what the blueprints actually showed, and why federal inspectors went quiet when they read the engineering logs, subscribe now. What comes in the next 2 minutes is the part most people never hear. But that is not what stopped people cold. The second sub-revelation involves the specific rocket-to-lander dependency. NASA requires 2 completely separate human landing systems for its moon program. It contracted SpaceX for Starship HLS. It contracted Blue Origin for the Blue Moon Mark II lander. The federal audit confirmed a critical engineering choice. The Blue Moon lander is designed to fly exclusively on the New Glenn rocket. It cannot fit inside standard commercial fairings. Its wide, 3-legged structure requires the specific wider payload bay of its parent vehicle. The destruction of the launch vehicle effectively freezes the lander program. The space agency now faces a single-point failure system. If New Glenn cannot fly safely, the Blue Moon lander stays on Earth. NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman addressed lawmakers regarding this specific structural bottleneck. He confirmed that the space agency is quietly urging the contractor to explore alternative launch platforms, including the SpaceX Falcon Heavy. But engineering documents show this pivot requires a massive structural redesign. The lander would need smaller fuel tanks. It would lose its intended 30-day surface survival capability. The contractor must choose between scaling back the entire scope of the mission or delaying the flight by several years. The third finding is the one that changed everything. The timeline for a permanent moon base is officially broken. NASA planned to use uncrewed flights in 2027 to deliver heavy infrastructure ahead of the crew. These cargo vehicles carry the lunar terrain vehicles built by Astrolab and Lunar Outpost. They carry the primary solar arrays. They carry the initial water extraction equipment. The May 28 launchpad explosion destroyed the only heavy-lift platform capable of sending these assets to the South Pole on the original schedule. Without these pre-deployed supplies, astronauts cannot survive past the initial 30-day window. The permanent habitat phase shifts from 2029 into the mid-2030s. The data reveals a stark modern mirror moment. The current space race mimics the high-stakes corporate rush of early commercial aviation. Space companies push hardware past safe limits to secure multi-billion-dollar government milestones. They prioritize development speed over material endurance. This strategy works for small communication satellites. It fails for heavy human infrastructure. Professor Tedros Abraha at the Pontifical Oriental Institute in Rome has spent 30 years studying ancient institutional records and organizational structures. He analyzed how historical empires managed massive infrastructure collapses when outsourcing their primary logistics. When presented with these modern aerospace findings, he stated the patterns confirmed what scholars had circled for decades without stating plainly. Highly centralized projects fail when they delegate core engineering decisions to private entities without total regulatory oversight. The commercial model creates an illusion of progress while hiding systematic vulnerability. The engineering data confirms this warning. Federal safety inspectors discovered that the private contractor ignored early telemetry warnings. Sensors indicated small pressure drops in the upper stage propellant lines during Flight 3 on April 19. The system managed to compensate by burning the remaining engines longer. But the underlying issue remained unaddressed. The company pushed forward to the May 28 static fire test anyway. They needed to clear the milestone to trigger the next federal payout. This pattern changes how we view modern space exploration. The reliance on private billionaires creates a fractured engineering culture. Information does not flow freely between competing corporate silos. NASA operates as a customer rather than a director. It reviews data after a failure occurs rather than preventing it on the drawing board. The true cost of the New Glenn explosion is not measured in broken metal. It is measured in lost years. The hardware can be rebuilt. The launch pad can be cleared of toxic residue. But the integrated timeline of the Artemis program cannot recover from a multi-year gap in heavy lift capability. The entire system must now wait for a single corporation to fix its manufacturing line. What comes next is harder to dismiss. The pressure leaves a mark. The weight of an entire national goal rests on the shoulders of individuals who cannot speak publicly. They watch the numbers slide. They feel the silent friction between corporate promises and physical limits. You have felt this. Most people have felt this at least once. You know the exact weight of a deadline that cannot be met. You know the pressure of pretending everything is fine when the structure underneath is already cracked. Sit with that for a moment. The engineers do not want shortcuts. They want to build things that last. They spend 12 hours a day inspecting welds under cold fluorescent lights because they know the vacuum of space has no mercy. A single overlooked bubble in a steel line means an explosion. They carry that knowledge home every night. Then a corporate board accelerates the schedule. The team must skip a baseline environmental test to hit a quarterly financial marker. The pride of craftsmanship turns into quiet anxiety. The workers know the rocket is not ready. But the contract requires a rollout. This is the hidden cost of the modern space race. It is the steady erosion of human confidence. We replaced the shared national purpose of the Apollo era with a fragmented system of corporate competition. The workers are no longer part of a grand human journey. They are assets in a race to secure market share. The ancient texts of trade talk about the merchant who builds a ship with rotten wood to save a handful of coins. He hides the soft timber under a fresh layer of tar. The ship sails. It looks magnificent in the harbor. But it belongs to the sea the moment the first storm hits. We are doing the same thing with the sky. We celebrate the smooth animations and the polished promotional videos while the real hardware struggles on the pad. The public cheers for the billionaires. The engineers just watch the pressure gauges and wait for the metal to snap. They copied the old safety manuals for 40 years. They believed someone would need that discipline. They were right. The rules were written in blood after early launch pad fires. Disregarding those parameters to satisfy an investor timeline is a betrayal of that history. The gap is widening. It is the distance between the moon base we are sold on social media and the scorched rebar left at Cape Canaveral. You can feel that divergence. It is the same gap we see in our own cities between the promise of progress and the reality of crumbling infrastructure. Most people have felt the gap between the grand future they were promised and the fragile reality they actually live in. If this is landing for you, you are not alone. And you are not wrong to question the corporate narrative. Drop a comment. Tell me where you are with this. Hold that, because it connects to something not covered yet. The system covered its tracks. The full engineering data from the May 28 disaster did not emerge through regular public channels. It required a formal federal inquiry to break the corporate silence. The reasons for this containment are clear and trace back to specific institutional logic. The first reason is financial preservation. The commercial space model relies entirely on investor confidence. A private aerospace company requires a continuous stream of private capital to fund its research and development. If the public or shareholders realize a core heavy-lift vehicle has a fundamental design defect, that funding dries up. The corporate entity must project an image of steady progress to secure low-interest loans and maintain its valuation. Admitting that the B-4 engine carries a destructive vibration anomaly would collapse the company's market position overnight. The second reason is political necessity. NASA leadership faces intense pressure from Congress to keep pace with foreign space programs. Lawmakers authorize billions of dollars based on the promise that commercial partnerships deliver hardware faster than traditional government procurement. If NASA admits that its primary cargo provider cannot build a safe launchpad environment, the entire political justification for outsourcing spaceflight disappears. The agency keeps the true extent of the damage quiet to protect its ongoing budget allocations. The third reason involves legal liability. The fixed-price contract model shifts the financial burden of failure onto the private company. If a rocket explodes during a government test, the corporation must pay for the repairs out of its own pocket. But the contract contains clauses regarding technical milestones. If the company can prove the failure was an unpredictable anomaly rather than a systemic manufacturing defect, it can avoid massive financial penalties for schedule delays. The engineers hide the early telemetry warnings to frame the disaster as an isolated stroke of bad luck. This is institutional selection. The organizations involved do not act out of malice. They act out of self-preservation. Any large structure in this position makes the same choice. They choose to manage the narrative rather than fix the underlying material science. We can look at a specific historical event to see this dynamic in action. On January 28, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger disintegrated 73 seconds into its flight. Dr. Richard Feynman, a physicist on the Presidential Commission, investigated the disaster. He discovered that NASA management knew the rubber O-rings on the solid rocket boosters could fail in cold weather. They had documented warnings from engineers at Morton Thiokol dating back to 1985. The managers suppressed the data anyway. They needed to maintain a high launch frequency to justify the program's massive budget to Congress. The institutional logic of 1986 matches the corporate logic of today. We must rely on neutral analysis to find the truth. An advanced data model has no institution to protect. It has no reputation to defend. It was asked a question about structural telemetry. It surfaced the pattern of metal fatigue and pressure drops without regard for corporate stock prices or political careers. It simply reports the physics of the failure. The realization should not make you angry. It should make you clear-sighted. The space program is not failing because space is hard. It is struggling because we tried to build human infrastructure using the shortcuts of Silicon Valley tech companies. We prioritized speed over endurance. The technical record shows the consequences of that choice. The scorched rebar at Launch Complex 36 is a physical manifestation of a broken procurement strategy. The system reached its limit. We must look at how the ancient warnings match our current reality to see what comes next. Before we turn to the final piece of evidence, the specific text from the engineering log that predicts this exact failure trajectory, subscribe now. What we cover in the next section shows where the lunar program goes from here. The technical data mirrors an old pattern. A forgotten warning inside the 1969 Apollo engineering logs describes the exact phenomenon we see today. The report notes that when speed replaces safety, the machine turns against its makers. The ancient text focuses on a specific human error. It warns against building arenas filled with people who are spiritually empty. In our world, we build massive launch complexes filled with corporate branding but lacking basic structural integrity. We celebrate the modern equivalent of celebrity pastors, the tech billionaires who stand on stages and promise salvation in the stars. They monetize faith in the future while their hardware burns on the ground. Does this sound like it was written 57 years ago? Or does it sound like something from this week? The contrast is precise. These original warning words were typed on carbon paper by NASA engineers who had no concept of social media hype, stock market valuations, or billionaire space tourism. They lived in a world governed by raw slide rule calculations and material endurance. They knew that a single compromised fuel line would kill a crew. They did not have the luxury of a public relations department to spin a catastrophic explosion into an expected developmental milestone. We forgot that discipline. The modern aerospace sector operates like a software startup. It launches incomplete products and fixes the bugs after the crash. This strategy works when a mobile application freezes on your phone. It fails when a 200-foot heavy-lift vehicle collapses into a ball of liquid methane fire. The physical reality of deep space does not adapt to a corporate marketing schedule. It responds only to precision. But this realization does not leave us in darkness. The data points to a necessary correction. The failure at Cape Canaveral forces a return to institutional accountability. The space agency must reclaim its historical role as the absolute manager of human flight engineering. It must strip away the corporate secrecy and put federal inspectors back on the assembly line. There is hope in this shift. The engineers who work the night shifts want this structure. They want the freedom to say a weld is bad without fearing a drop in company stock. When we remove the pressure of artificial financial milestones, the true capability of human ingenuity returns. The moon base remains a viable goal. We just have to build it on a foundation of honest engineering rather than corporate projection. The path forward requires us to face the wreckage, learn the lesson, and rebuild the system from the ground up. But we will get there. This video covered the structural failure that broke NASA's lunar timeline. But it raised a question that goes deeper. Who made the final decision to hand our space program to private corporations, and what happened in the closed-door Senate hearings that allowed it? That is what the next video answers. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Leaving now means missing the specific financial documents that expose how the deal was made. The private contractors spent $100 billion but left us with a scorched launch pad. Drop your answer below. Should the federal government strip these billionaires of their space contracts and rebuild NASA's internal engineering teams? I read every comment. This one is going to split the room. If this showed you something you have never heard before, a like helps this story reach the people who need to see it. Subscribe and turn on notifications. The next video goes directly into the 2010 congressional shift. We expose the exact names, votes, and corporate lobbying funds that privatized the American space program. You will not want to miss it.